Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about rules of origin in the UK's Free Trade Agreement with the EU, brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this afternoon. And thank you all for joining us today. This is clearly a topic of great interest to UK traders. We already have almost 1,500 people on the call already, so a warm welcome to you all. These numbers aren't too much of a surprise given some of the headlines we've seen about rules of origin so far this year, and the need for companies to comply with the rules in order to qualify for tariff-free trade with the EU. To guide you through these rules and their implications for traders, I'm delighted to welcome today's presenter in Kevin Shakespeare, the Director of the Institute's Training Academy. Kevin, here we go again for another webinar. How are you today?
Hello, Will, I'm fine, and good afternoon, everybody.
And if we move on to the next slide, just for those of you who don't know, so I'm not sure, Kevin's just moving to the next slide. Kevin has developed several educational programs for the Institute, is the Dean of the UK and Northern Ireland Customs Academies, and also currently manages specialist customs training resources for HMRC's Trader Support Service. Kevin has worked with Invest NI, Scottish Enterprise, UK Export Finance, the Saudi Export Development Authority, and is an approved UN International Trade trainer. However, on the next slide, before we move on to Kevin's presentation, you'll see our first poll in which we're going to find out a little bit more about your business. So if we can launch that poll, please. And this first poll is asking you, which of these best describes your business? And the options there are manufacturing exporter, manufacturing importer, customs intermediary, e-commerce or retail, and other. And if any of these options apply to both of you, maybe just pick the one which is more dominant for your business. Just while you are answering that poll though, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions towards the end of the webinar, but please do bear in mind that we have already received a lot of questions in advance, so we will not be able to get to all of your queries today. However, if you feel as though your answer has not been answered by the end, please do review our technical helpline or training and consultancy offerings, which we'll talk about later in the webinar. Secondly, you will all receive access to today's slide pack and a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So please do try to listen in carefully to today's presentation. But if we can close that poll, please, and share the results. So just in terms of the response, thank you everyone for answering. 39% of you are manufacturers and exporting, 15% importing, and then 8% intermediaries, 9% e-commerce or retail, and 29% other. If we move on to the second poll, we're just going to drill down a little bit further to find out even more about your business. So the second question is, if you are a manufacturer, importer or exporter, which of these best describes your business? So we've got automotive, food and drink, engineering/chemicals, technology, or again, other. Now, Kevin, while people are answering the second poll, I'd just like to quickly ask, for those of you who are less familiar with the topic, what are rules of origin and why have they been in the news so much this year?
Yeah, thank you, Will. And I think, as you've indicated, rules of origin is a very popular topic at the moment, and it's an area which for some of you maybe dealing with rest of world trade, you may be familiar with the concept of rules of origin, whereas others maybe just trading with the European Union, it's raising new challenges or new areas. So I guess one way of describing rules of origin is the economic nationality of the good. So it confers that in this instance, if we're looking at it from a UK business perspective, UK origin. And why is that important? It's important that that conference of UK origin meets the requirements for preferential trade, which is going to be the main focus of today. And in trade agreements negotiated between the European Union, UK, the UK and third countries, it is that each product, each tariff line will have a certain percentage threshold in terms of rules of origin, which is why this is hugely important. And also today, we'll look at the concept within the UK-EU trade deal, bilateral cumulation as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And if we could quickly close this poll and share the results. So perhaps we need to get better at our poll options, because 48% of you say other, though we are limited to 5, so that might explain it partly. But of those who were able to state their sector, 21% are in engineering or chemicals, 13% food and drink, 11% technology, and 6% automotive. If we could close that poll now, though. That's enough from me, and thank you everyone for answering those questions, but I'd like to now hand over to Kevin. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. So in terms of what we're going to look at today, we will be looking at the contents, the origin of the UK-EU FTA, so which, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So we're just going to provide a summary of that. We're going to look at the concept, the application of bilateral cumulation, which I just referred to. Some key principles around origin, which is importers' knowledge and then proving or proof evidence of origin. We're going to look at the potential role of customs warehousing. And I think it's only fair today that we also refer to Generalised System of Preferences, GSP, and that's also reflective of the quite high number of questions we're getting at the Institute currently on this topic. And then we'll do a review of further customs authorisations and procedures. So in the context of rules of origin in the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, we had our webinar on the 5th of January, which was extremely well attended, and we indicated this concept of 100% tariff liberalisation in the trade deal. And no tariffs, quotas on movements of goods produced between UK and EU. But a key principle of this is around requiring to meet rules of origin requirements. And if those requirements are met, no tariffs apply for goods sold to the EU and no tariff apply for goods received from the EU, so covering both the export and the import side. And those are some of the key principles, but as we'll look at today, there are several further considerations. And evidence of origin must be provided, and this evidence point is also fundamental. So an example we referred to back on the 5th of January was motor vehicles. So we looked at examples in terms of the chapter code and subheadings, and we referred to the fact that there needed to be this percentage threshold, in this case on motor vehicles, around what was referred to as maximum NOM, the maximum value of non-originating materials which are allowed, which is expressed as a percentage. And we referred to the fact on some products that it was 45%, and other products like parts for electric cars, for example, it had a higher level of max NOM, so 70%, and in the case of internal combustion engine electric motors, 60%, so hybrids in those cases. So we can see there, even within certain product types, in this case motor vehicles, there are different maximum levels, percentage levels. Whereas if we consider it from the point of view of medical goods, we can see that it's more standardized there in terms of the maximum non-originating materials of 50%. But all I'm trying to do here is illustrate the different percentages and thresholds which apply within the actual EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it's important for every business to look at what your percentage maximum non-originating materials are. Now, If I now pass over back to Will for another poll, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And so the next poll, we are asking, do you feel confident with your understanding of rules of origin as they are in the UK-EU trade deal? And there's a sliding scale from yes, very confident to not at all confident and not sure as well. So just while giving you a few minutes to answer that poll, we've got a couple of questions in already, and a few people asking around declarations. So there's a question in from Nigel who's asking, we import products from into the UK from the EU, but do not quite understand our import declaration requirements. So I'm just wondering, Kevin, if you could say a little bit more about declarations and where rules of origin relate to declarations.
Yeah, again, thank you very much for the question. So with regard to the principles which have always been there, when goods move from one customs territory to another, and now we're in two separate customs territories, the European Union and the UK, but more particularly in this instance, GB, Great Britain. There is a requirement for both an export declaration, so in this example for goods leaving the European Union, and an import declaration for goods entering Great Britain. So there is a need for a declaration, it is important. It's another area we're seeing a lot of activity, is understanding of the border operating model in GB. And the phasing, which does allow for standard goods for declarations to be made 6 months, up to 6 months after the date of importation. That does not mean that declarations are not required. They are required. It's just in theory or in practice, it is feasible to make what we call an entry into declarants records, an EIDR, with declaration up to 6 months later. But businesses or their agent must be approved under a customs authorization process called CFSP, Customs Freight Simplified Procedures. And this is an area at the Institute that we will be talking more about, because it's an area that we feel from questions that businesses need further support around declarations, and if the phasing of the border operating model is being applied, that the awareness that declarations are required may not be there. But rules of origin then are very important in terms of those goods entering the UK from the European Union free of duty based on the origin of the goods. So really that's where origin really comes into play.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope that's been useful for people asking those questions. If we can quickly share the results of that poll, and a good 84% of you answered this. So out of over 2,000, this is a pretty substantial result. 45% of you have said you're not very confident with your understanding of the rules. 31% yes, but then a further 15% not at all confident. So me and Kevin, obviously, we know these rules came out quite late in the day, as the trade deal was announced quite late in 2020. Is there any surprise there at the level of a lack of confidence, and 45% saying they're not at all confident at the moment?
Yeah, I think it depends on obviously the nature of your business. So where it's, as we're going to look at the concept of wholly obtained, the concept will be more straightforward for a business if the goods are wholly obtained in the UK, for example, or are totally UK originated. So it will depend on the actual circumstances, the nature of the goods, and I think that will impact the understanding. But if you have more complex elements, such as goods entering GB from the EU and then going back to the EU, or are re-exported, say, to Ireland, you have an element of complexity. And you also have complexity if you're bringing the goods in from, say, China, Taiwan, United States, and other countries as well. So the understanding may be influenced by the complexity, but we do appreciate that there's some very good and very experienced businesses out there as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And back to the presentation.
Thank you. So we're now going to look at the concept of application of bilateral cumulation, and this is really a really important area, and again a question that we get a significant number of inquiries at the Institute. Now, what the free trade agreement says is that the concept of bilateral cumulation applies. And the concept is that it allows EU inputs and processing to be counted as UK input in UK products which are exported to the EU, and vice versa, of course. Now, but if we sort of dwell on this a bit further, it means that goods being shipped from the UK to the EU under the trade agreement must have undergone sufficient processing to confer UK origin. So as we're going to look at, and we're going to look at some scenarios and examples in the next few slides, this term sufficient processing is going to become very, very key. Now, if there is insufficient processing, tariffs may apply. And this again becomes a sort of key principle. And again, we're going to look at examples, unless customs special procedures are applied. And I'll explain more about that again in the next few slides. So let's look at scenario 1 here. Scenario 1 where there is no processing. So you have EU originated goods which are exported from the European Union, and then they're imported into Great Britain into free circulation. So when we mean free circulation, they're effectively customs cleared and they're available for the home economy, for example. In that instance, the origin remains EU, European Union. Now, the goods would have had to have undergone sufficient processing to confer UK origin. Now, if that was not the case, sometimes referred to as a secondary movement or a secondary export, the goods will retain their EU origin, and upon onward export and onward import to the European Union, tariffs would apply. So this is the concept of processing. So just to clarify, if there's no processing, then tariffs would apply. So if goods move from the EU to Great Britain, no processing, sent back or exported to the European Union upon import into the EU, tariffs will apply. A key principle to note. So let's look at another example here around use of customs special procedures. So you again have your EU origin originating goods exported from the EU, imported into Great Britain. But in this case, it's not into free circulation, it's placed in a customs duty suspension regime, so customs warehousing. In this instance, the goods retain their EU status because they've not been declared or declared into free circulation. So in that instance, goods can be moved back into the European Union without tariffs being charged, but only provided that the goods remain in duty suspension while in Great Britain. So here we can see the relevance of customs warehouse, and we'll speak more about that shortly. Evidence, however, may be needed to be provided to the EU importer in that regard. And it's a key theme throughout, evidence. Having documentation, having evidence becomes important for any customs procedure, any customs authorization, and clearly for declarations as well. So if we move on now to scenario 3, we look at the concept of minimal processing. So we've had no processing, customs special procedures. Now let's look at a scenario of minimal processing. So again, we have EU originated goods exported from the EU into UK, Great Britain, and then released for free circulation. So not in a customs procedure. They are subject in this instance to minimal processing. So for example, repackaging and relabeling. In this instance, this minimal processing is not enough to confer UK origin, and again, tariffs would apply on inward import to the EU. So export from GB and onward import to the EU. So we have no processing, minimal processing, and tariffs apply in both cases. And then we have scenario 4, a sufficient transformation. So in EU, again, release for free circulation in the UK, Great Britain, subject to processing beyond the operations listed. So there is an insufficient processing article. And an example would be where you're importing ingredients or more raw materials and manufacturing into finished goods. So sufficient transformation. The finished product will qualify for preference, and no tariffs will apply on onward import into the EU, clearly assuming that the finished product meets the rules of origin requirements, of course, and the threshold. So we can see here the importance. So we have no processing, minimal processing, sufficient transformation, and use of customs warehouse in our example. So all these become important principles in how businesses trade and the nature of your business, whether your business is carrying out production, manufacturing processes in Great Britain, whether it's a distribution business. And we can see that there's different elements to consider depending on the nature of your business and the level of processing or not, as the case may be. Now let's look at something that's also being referred to as a possible solution for this no processing or minimal processing issue, is the concept of returns goods relief, which has possibilities but also has considerations it's important to add. So the EU legislation on returns goods duty relief may apply provided certain requirements are fulfilled. So, for example, the product has not received a treatment other than altering its appearance. So, for example, to repair the product, restore it to good condition, or maintain the product in good condition. So there are certain considerations that apply on possible use of returns goods relief. In this instance, upon re-export to the European Union, if these circumstances and considerations apply, no tariffs would apply. However, the EU importer does require evidence of the initial EU export declaration to apply, excuse me, the principle of returns goods relief. And that initial evidence may be commercially sensitive, unless, of course, the company is related. So, for example, intercompany movements, transactions. So returns goods relief does provide possibilities, but it must be borne in mind that the EU importer will require evidence of the initial EU export declaration, which could be commercially sensitive. So now let's consider, and we looked a little bit of it on the 5th of January in terms of importers' knowledge and proof of origin. Also important in the context of the wider rules of origin. So just to summarize, before we looked at the application of bilateral cumulation, we looked at the scenarios as they apply for businesses. So if we now consider some of the principles, again, underpinning origin of the trade deal, the importer is required to declare, so this is the importer, that they hold proof that the goods meet the rules of origin. So the importer must declare, and they must have knowledge, referred to as importer's knowledge, in order to benefit from preferential tariffs. And again, that applies if you're importing into GB from the EU, or you're the EU importer imported into the EU from Great Britain. So proof may be important at the time of claiming preference, so claiming preferential tariffs, zero tariffs when importing. That's one thing to consider. Another thing which is vitally important is that proof will be important at the time of audit. So subject to customs audit, which clearly will be subsequent to the time of importing, proof will be necessary. So businesses cannot just claim preference. They will require evidence, both possibly at the time of importing and certainly at the time of audit. So businesses must bear that in mind. So again, we have this concept of statement of origin, which is prevalent in a lot of modern trade agreements. And a statement of origin is the text by which the exporter or the producer states the product's origin. And that can be printed on an invoice, certainly a commercial invoice, and other commercial documentation. So, for example, a packing list and a pro forma invoice. If we think of an example here, here's an example statement of origin. We have the exporter reference number declaring that the products are of UK preferential origin, and then we have the origin criteria used, which then becomes important around, is it wholly obtained or produced in the UK? Does it use of exclusive originating materials in the UK? Is it subject to substantial transformation? So, for example, goods coming in from China, for example, is it use of accumulation, or is it subject to tolerance by value? So the origin criteria must be used, and the importer clearly will need that statement of origin, importer's knowledge, coming back to our earlier point. So if, to clarify, if claiming preference on basis of importer's knowledge or making out a statement of origin, we have this grace period, if you like, where you do not need to hold a supplier's declaration at the time of claiming preference. And that would be up to the, that actually should read up to the 31st of December 2021. So up to the end of this year, you have this waiver that you do not need to hold a supplier's declaration at the time they are claiming preference. However, there could be some circumstances where your customer will require a supplier's declaration in advance, and you certainly should not wait to the last minute before gathering all the required declarations. Now, here you have in slide 23 an example of supplier's declaration. Now, I would stress that this example is really only applicable for where value is added by manufacturing production. So where production is carried out for the purposes of determining origin, whether the finished item is originating, a supplier's declaration would need to be obtained. And we would stress that this is in certain circumstances. This is an area which is evolving as well, and it's evolving in both supplier and client-customer communications. But we do appreciate in some specific circumstances that this could be an issue. And there may be some circumstances where suppliers may not be prepared to provide these declarations as an annex to the commercial invoice, and that could be for reasons of confidentiality. So there could be instances where a supplier might not be prepared because it's disclosing their own supplier sources and possibly revealing profit margins. There will be certain sectors, certain supply sources where that will be an impact. Again, you're welcome to pose questions on that, and it is an area we are getting a number of questions on from the Institute, a high number of questions currently, as well as around bilateral cumulation. So if we now look at customs warehousing, we referred to it earlier, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into it. So let's look at the benefits of customs warehousing, and again, by way of summary. Goods exported from the EU to GB and to declared into free circulation, which we referred to earlier in one of our scenarios, scenario 2, with no transformation. The goods are re-exported from GB to the EU, for example, Ireland. In these circumstances, they will be subject to payment of import duties in Ireland because they're declared into free circulation with no transformation taking place. Back to our scenario 2 earlier, or our scenario 1, I should say, in terms of no transformation. But if we take this example further, goods exported from the EU to GB and placed in duty suspension in a customs approved warehouse. So in this case, it's not in free circulation, it's in duty suspension in a customs approved warehouse. Goods are re-exported from GB to the EU, again, for example, Ireland, with zero tariffs applying as goods remain in duty suspension. Now, it's all very well saying, yes, let's go and set up a customs approved warehouse. There are a number of considerations. It requires approval from HMRC, and there is an approval process and forms and areas to consider, which we'll look at in the next slide. Something which is benefiting businesses is the requirement for financial guarantees in Great Britain to use customs warehousing and other special procedures has been withdrawn. Financial guarantees will be required for high-risk traders. For example, traders with a history of non-compliance, for example. So we can see here benefits of customs warehousing, but I would stress again that an approval process is required to use a customs approved warehouse. Now we think of the authorization requirements for customs warehousing. We have both the concept of a public warehouse where businesses can store goods belonging to other businesses, or we have a private warehouse, customs approved warehouse for businesses who want to store their own goods. And where the warehouse authorization holder and depositor is the same business. Let's say the importer who is subsequently re-exporting the goods. So if we think about some of the requirements here, and there are things to be considered. The business must be established in the UK, they must have an IORI number, they must be financially solvent. They do need a good compliance record with customs, they must evidence a need for the warehouse, they must be able to make declarations themselves or through an agent, they must be able to keep good stock records and clearly maintain health and safety standards. So there is a process here for obtaining customs approved warehousing. It's great to say it's a solution, but it is important to note that there is a process involved. Now at this stage, I'm going to pass back to Will for a poll. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So if we launch the next poll, we are now interested to see whether you on the audience are interested in any of the following customs procedures or authorizations. So we've listed customs freight simplified procedures, customs warehousing, inward processing, outward processing, and authorized economic operator status, or AEO. Now, Kevin, you've mentioned, obviously, you've talked about customs warehousing a fair bit, but I'm just wondering if you could describe the other ones listed there in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, certainly will. Thank you. So I know the first one up there was CFSP, Customs Freight Simplified Procedures, which is important as well, both important in the context of the border operating model and the phasing of imports. If declarations have not been made, that you will need to be CFSP approved to have an agent. But some of the benefits of that are expedited customs clearance. Initially a less number of data fields, and then the supplementary declaration following that is required by the 4th working day of the following month, outside of course of the border operating model. Now inward processing is an interesting one there, and examples which I tend to use would be goods that are coming in from, say, from Asia, which are not subject to a UK trade agreement of any sort, China, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, for example, and those goods are subject to a manufacturing process or production process, so raw materials into finished parts. So in those instances, is you don't pay import duty, so the import duty and VAT is suspended on those goods whilst the process takes place, and the import duty and VAT is only then paid after release into the home economy. But then perhaps more particularly relevant upon re-export, so upon export to the European Union, for example, which is now an export, that import duty and import VAT is eliminated. So for businesses involved in processing procedures, and that can involve ingredients as well, then inward processing is important. So conscious of time, that there is also the procedure of outward processing as well. And then there is the bigger consideration around authorized economic operator. And it's interesting, the trade deal refers to the concept of simplifications or discussions going forward on use of AEO. So there's AEO-C, custom simplification, and there's AEO-S for supply chain benefits around safety and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And if we just close that poll, please, and share the results. Just while that's happening, just a reminder to everyone that we will be sharing the slides and the recording of this webinar in an email, follow-up email to all registrants, which will be going out tomorrow morning. Yeah, just to answer a few people who've been asking about that. In terms of the poll, so a quarter of you said CFSP would be your most interested procedure, 21% customs warehousing and inward processing, and then 16% for each of outward processing and AEO. Is that a surprise, Kevin? It's relatively even split, I'd say.
Yeah, it is. And again, thank you for everyone for completing the poll. There may be some instances where some business here may already have some of these procedures and authorizations, but equally there may be instances where more than one of them will be applicable for your business, and you obviously could only answer one. But it's really interesting, and it's interesting to see 25% for CFSP, because that is going to be a key initiative also in trade going forward. And there's also been a simplification of the application form to apply for CFSP. But thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And if we can close that poll and onto the final stretch of the presentation.
Okay, we're now going to look at generalized system of preferences, and as I said, it's a question we are getting in a number of cases. So generalized system of preferences clearly is a preferential system for lesser developed and least developed countries upon exporting to large trading blocks and trading areas like the European Union, United States, United Kingdom, for example. And if we consider this in the context of UK-EU trade, it also becomes quite interesting. So the EU introduced this principle, which is relatively recent over the last few years, called the non-manipulation principle, which replaced the direct transport rule, which gives more flexibility in terms of supply chain movements. So let's work through the next few slides, because there are a number of considerations. It allows UK businesses duty-free movements, provided products declared for release for free circulation in the EU must be the same products as exported from the GSP beneficiary country. And there's clearly a number of countries we can refer to that are GSP countries, the likes of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and a good number of further countries there. But those goods must not have been altered, transformed in any way, or subject to operations other than to preserve them in good condition. So let's refocus on that point. It allows UK businesses duty-free movements, provided those products are declared for release for free circulation in the EU, as long as they're the same products as exported from the, say, Pakistan, Bangladesh, for example. But let's look at this further in the next slide. So as long as the goods meet the EU GSP rules of origin, the goods can move from a GSP country, supplier, to the EU via Great Britain, provided the following conditions are met. The goods are not altered, they're not transformed in any way, and they're not subject to operations other than to preserve them in their condition. And thinking about this further, storage of the products may take place provided they remain under customs supervision in the country or countries of transit. So again, we can see this concept of customs supervision, or the goods are moving in countries of transit. So to meet these requirements, goods must be held in a customs warehouse or moved under transit, so under customs supervision. So GSP can apply, but we have a number of considerations for the goods moving, in this instance, from a GSP country supplier to the EU via Great Britain, but these conditions require to be met. And that also includes goods remaining under customs supervision. So it is possible splitting of consignments, again, providing the goods remain under customs supervision. And the customs authorities clearly may require the declarant to provide evidence of compliance, including transport documents. So as we come towards the end of this slide, so just want to have some further considerations, and this links a little bit in with the poll question from earlier. So to summarise, what we are seeing a big increase and a big demand at the Institute at the moment, which we're serving our members in terms of use of customs special procedures and authorisations. The trading environment in 2021 is clearly different from what it has been before, and we are seeing increased use of these procedures, such as applications for procedures and authorisations, such as CFSP, customs warehousing, inward processing. And the benefits are clear. Clearly, there is an application process and businesses have to look at records, and the Institute is supporting a lot of businesses in this at the moment. The benefits clearly include suspension or elimination of duties and VAT. And I've indicated there in popular. Now, we do have a further big session coming up on transit, because we know transit's very important, and the Institute are launching major initiatives on transit as well. You will require authorisation from HMRC, but it's also important to stress that compliance and audit requirements must be met. That is very, very important there. Now, to sort of summarise where we are, the Institute provide a lot of practical support for businesses. We have membership services, including technical helplines, and we have a record considerable number of technical helpline questions we're getting from our members currently. We have rules of origin training courses, which are again proving very popular because of demand from businesses. We have customs warehousing training courses. We also offer consultancy services, which can involve taking businesses through customs warehousing, CFSP, other authorisations, and it can also be a compliance health check. So looking at the procedures in businesses at the moment, what businesses require to do in terms of customs and trade procedures. And also very popular is our 30-minute trade surgeries as well. And also we're introducing 1-hour trade surgeries there. So clearly we're servicing a lot for our members here, and clearly if you're a member of the Institute, there are benefits and reduced costs for access to these services. They are available generally to non-members, but for members there are discounted costs there. And we will be sending links to the above that we'll be providing in follow-up emails. So on that note, I'm going to pass back to Will, and I'm very conscious we've received a very, very high number of questions, both before, during, and I'm sure after as well. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Will.
Yes, indeed, Kevin. We've had absolutely loads of questions, hundreds probably. So do bear with us if we don't get to your question in the next 15 minutes or so. There are ways of getting your questions answered, as stated in that previous slide. The first question, though, I will put to you is from Petra, who's asked, if EU originating goods are imported into Great Britain and then subsequently exported in an unaltered condition back into the EU, will preferential tariffs still apply? And just a follow-up to that question, we've had lots of people asking about Percy pigs, and I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what happened with Percy pigs and maybe apply that as a case study to the presentation we've just been listening to just now.
So in answer to the first question, if goods are exported from the EU to Great Britain and there's no alteration, no processing to it, upon re-export to the European Union, if those goods are in free circulation, so declared, and they're not in duty suspension, such as a customs warehouse, then tariffs will apply. Sometimes that's also referred to as a secondary movement. So in that instance, tariffs will apply. So I think with the example referred to, which clearly is one that's received visibility, but there are other examples as well. I believe the goods were from Germany coming into Great Britain and then, for example, going to Ireland, which is an example for many, but It's not just about Ireland. Goods could come in from European Union and they could be exported back to the European Union without any processing. So it could be Germany, France, Netherlands, Poland, and Czech Republic, and various countries in the European Union. But if there is no processing, then tariffs will apply on those goods upon import into the European Union.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you for the questions as well, everyone who was asking about Percy Pigs. A question from Gareth, who's asked, how do these rules apply to Northern Ireland?
Okay, so Northern Ireland is different in this respect, and clearly I've referred a lot today to Great Britain there. So with regard to goods moving to Northern Ireland, if we say, we look at it a couple of ways, both from GB and the European Union. So goods moving to Northern Ireland will come under the Northern Ireland Protocol. So if we think about this from a rules of origin perspective here, if goods move from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and they stay in Northern Ireland, then any businesses involved in that should sign up to the UK Trader Scheme, and that is different from the Trader Support Scheme. The Trader Support Scheme is there to support the requirement for inbound customs declarations and entry safety and security declarations. So the UK Trader Scheme is there to support businesses effectively indicate that the goods are staying in Northern Ireland, but businesses must have evidence that they've stayed in Northern Ireland. They can't just say they are to avoid any risk of tariffs or any at-risk process for the goods entering Ireland. Now, in terms of goods entering Ireland, in theory, it's very similar principles in terms of the rules of origin and where the goods have started from. So there needs to be evidence of origin, but very important if goods are staying in Northern Ireland, then that you sign up to the UK Trader Scheme. Now, there are a few nuances around that. If your goods are entering a production process, so again, raw materials into finished goods, they could be deemed to be at risk. There is a small processing exemption. So possible use of inward processing there could be a useful way of resolving that, but it does depend on the circumstances. If goods are moving from the European Union to Northern Ireland, there are no tariffs, no customs declarations, but goods would need to move. If they move through Great Britain, they would need to move under a transit procedure. Clearly, they could also move from the European Union to Northern Ireland through the English Channel as well.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope that's answered some of your questions there. Question is your favourite topic, Kevin. It's one you often come to in these webinars. It's Incoterms. So a few people have asked about this, but I'll pick one from Wayne, who's asked, there remains a lot of questions about the level of duties being imposed, but where can we evaluate these to consider whether we should use delivery at place, DAP, or delivery duty paid, DDP? Yeah, so I think one way of looking at it is under DDP and DAP, it is the responsibility of the exporter to arrange the haulage and delivery to the named place. So, for example, the buyer's premises. The differences with DDP and DAP, or some of the key differences is that under DDP, it is the responsibility of the exporter to make the both declarations, both the export declaration and the import declaration. And the exporter is also responsible if there are any import duties and also for import VAT as well. Whereas under DAP, it's the importer's responsibility for making the import declaration and responsibility for import VAT and also responsibility for import duties if there are any. So there are clear distinctions between DDP and DAP, and it is subject to negotiation. It's a commercial discussion, a commercial negotiation between the exporter and the overseas buyer importer
in the same way as price, payment terms are subject to commercial negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne, for the question. A question just in from Aaron, who's asked, are there any differences in requirements on low-value e-commerce shipments?
So with regard, it's really interesting in terms of low-value e-commerce in that trade with the European Union, if we consider it from Great Britain first of all, really reverts to the same way in terms of trade with the rest of the world. So in theory, there are no specific requirements to e-commerce. I would stress with e-commerce, there are a number of other considerations. If express operators, fast parcel operators are being used, you do need to have discussions with those express operators. But the principle is that declarations are still required. Goods, products of animal origin, for example, will or may require export health certificates. That situation, unfortunately, does not change. There is currently a low-value consignment relief applicable in the EU of €22. That is being removed from the 1st of July. So it's another consideration. If you are selling e-commerce considerably within the European Union, there are obviously other further considerations around distance selling that have to be taken into account as well. So a number of considerations for e-commerce, but the principle generally is that trade with EU is similar to trade with the rest of the world. Declarations and certification is required.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you again, Aaron, for the question. We've had loads of questions basically going through different journeys of goods, so I'm going to try and sum up a couple. So this one from Karen summarizes this journey. So Karen exports to the EU under the trade deal, and then she's asking, can her customer re-export outside of the EU, and what are the tariff implications there?
Okay, so in those instances, if those goods are GB originating, then those goods will enter the EU under the zero tariff. Now, if those goods are being re-exported to the outside the EU, there's a number of considerations. One is the country of export. Is it a country where the European Union has a trade agreement, and the EU has trade agreements with 74, 75 countries, I think it is now. So in that case, it would need to meet the rules of origin requirement of the EU trade agreement, which will differ. The percentage, the maximum of non-originating EU materials will need to be taken into account. So it depends on the country. It depends on what happens when those goods enter the European Union. So do they enter the European Union? When they enter the European Union, are they subject to transformation, production, all the same issues that we've considered today? So those are a number of considerations for goods entering the European Union. Again, there will be maybe specific circumstances depending on the nature of the product.
Thank you, Kevin. And a question from Shirley, who's asked, if we have imported goods from the USA for stock and then at a later date sold them to a customer in Spain, should the duty be payable in Spain?
Okay, so if you've imported goods in the United States, then there is no trade deal between the UK and the United States. So import tariffs will apply based on the UK global import tariff. And we must stress that is different, or in a lot of cases is different from what you would have been familiar with previously, which was use of the EU common external tariff. So tariffs would be based on the UK global import tariff, which clearly depends on the actual product. Now, again, it depends on the origin of the goods, whether any transformation takes place or in the processing takes place in Great Britain, as to whether those goods are then remain US origin or they become GB origin through the transformation process. and that then influences whether they meet the requirements in terms of origin for the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. One consideration also, and it does depend on the circumstances, is possibly use of customs warehousing if there's no processing, or inward processing if there is processing taking place. So again, there's a number of additional considerations there, because there is no trade deal, certainly no trade deal currently between the US and the United Kingdom.
For now, anyway, and probably for a while. Another question, possibly of a similar event, one from Tim, who's asked, we manufacture in China, import to the UK, and then sell onto EU countries. Are all our partners in EU countries now subject to WTO tariffs? If so, how and when is this tariff collected?
Okay, so again, let's just quickly work through this. So we have goods moving from China to the United Kingdom. There is no trade deal between China and the United Kingdom, no trade deal between China and the European Union either. So when those goods are imported into the UK, tariffs will apply, based again on the UK global import tariff for the specific product tariff line. And it depends what happens to those goods. If those goods and no processing takes place, they cannot be conferred as UK origin, and tariffs will additionally apply when the goods move from the UK to the European Union. There is a possibility, clearly, again, of using customs warehousing. If there is processing somewhere, then a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that if there is sufficient transformation, then those goods possibly could be conferred as UK origin, depending on the level of transformation, and also tolerance. And also possibility of using inward processing, where the import duties and import VAT from China are suspended whilst those goods are in processing, and upon re-exporting, those import duties and import VAT is eliminated and does not apply. So a number of considerations there, depending on what happens to those goods, whether they enter under duty suspension in the UK, and whether there is any processing transformation in the UK. So again, it does depend on the specific circumstances there.
Okie dokie. I'm going to do a couple more questions as we're starting one low on time. This is a really good question from David, who imports solder from Japan with a customs authorization at zero duty, then distributes the products into the EU, which also has the same zero duty agreement with Japan. Do we have to pay third country duties in the EU countries, and if so, why?
Okay, so as you've indicated, clearly Japan and the UK have a free trade agreement, and yes, Japan clearly has a free trade agreement with the European Union as well. Now, there was some discussion in the trade talks between the UK and the EU, certainly for some products, and certainly the automotive sector was an example used. Is that could Japanese content be incorporated into EU inputs, but unfortunately that is not the case. So it's not happening. So when goods move from UK to Japan, they will come under the terms of the trade deal, subject to the maximum non-originating materials. If they're wholly obtained in Japan, for example, use Japanese originated materials, they will enter zero tariffs. So I would stress under the UK-Japan that zero tariffs do not apply for all goods. There is some phasing of goods over the next few years. The goods then would need to confer UK origin, would need to have some form of sufficient transformation for those goods to be classed as UK origin, which is back to our transformation point as well. And that's clearly an important point for Japan and other trade agreements that the UK has. We could go on: South Africa, Canada, Morocco, Mexico, and so on.
Very interesting. Okay, a couple quick fire questions to finish off with. One from Deborah, where can we find the max norm rules for each commodity code? And then one from Ken, how could free ports change any of these arrangements?
Okay, so interesting question. So with regard to the maximum rules, generally they're published in the further details of the trade deal. Clearly, there are a huge number of pages. I think over 2,200 to go through there, but they will be published, and that goes for other UK trade deals as well. Now, with regard to free ports, it's an interesting one. So we've talked a lot about special procedures today in terms of free ports. So I think it's important to note there for free ports that is that things like financial guarantees are not required for use of customs procedures. There is flexibility in terms of when valuation of goods takes place within the free port. If the free port operator is an authorized economic operator, there is possibilities of conferring AEO status to businesses in the free ports, and it is there are obviously benefits to free ports, and as long as they are modern, fair, transparent free ports, and there are a number of customs trade procedures that can operate within free ports. And I think hopefully in the UK free ports, we'll see many benefits, but both in terms of the economy, regeneration, use of land, but also we'll see use of customs and trade procedures in line with modern advanced free ports. And there are a number of customs and trade procedures that can be used within free ports, as long as they are transparent. Thank you.
And on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up now. So thank you once again to Kevin for the presentation and answers. I hope everyone has found that useful. We covered an awful lot today, and we will be continuing to provide webinars and information about the UK-EU trade deal. And so go to our site export.org.uk for more information. If you do need further support or assistance, please do remember to look at our membership and training offerings. And again, we'll be circulating links to some of the support Kevin mentioned earlier. For now, though, thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope to see you on the next one. Goodbye, everyone.